this week's Torah portion, Parshat Lech Lecha, we read about Avraham traveling to the land of Israel with his nephew Lot. Immediately upon settling down in the land of Israel, Avram and his nephew Lot have a disagreement. According to Rashi, the great French medieval commentator, it was not a petty fight, but rather the two of them were having a fundamental philosophical disagreement regarding their relationship to the land and how they should interact with their local neighbors. This being the first time the Torah records our connection to the land, it would seem that disagreements, disputes, differences of opinion are intrinsic to the land of Israel. There is something about this land that brings about internal disputes. And I would suggest this is not a reason for despair. This primal disputative response to the land of Israel is actually something worth celebrating. Elie Wiesel once famously said, "The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference." No one can claim that Jews are indifferent to the land of Israel. On the contrary, you're better off talking about politics and mass policies among Jews than talking about Israeli politics and policies. The excitement, the passion, the deep emotion that is generated through this topic is a reflection of how important the land of Israel is to each and every one of us and how deeply we care about our fellow brothers and sisters who live in this holy land. So yes, Avraham and Lot immediately upon arriving in the land of Israel argue, they fight. But they do so because they recognize how important this land is to our destiny and identity. How we relate to her and her inhabitants is an essential part of who we are. So we're about to hear from a number of esteemed thinkers and leaders reflecting views across the political spectrum. Undoubtedly, there are a variety of opinions about the state of Israel among us all here. And these are important conversations that need to take place. It would be morally lacking to gloss over our differences when the stakes are so high. But before we begin to focus on what and where we disagree, let's take a small moment to celebrate our shared concern, our shared love, our shared passion for Eretz Yisrael, the land and state of Israel, and for Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. Hinei matov u'mana'im, it is so beautiful to see so many people in this room who care passionately about our shared homeland and about our people. Thank you for being here, and thank you for caring.
My name is Karen Levin, Executive Director of the Baltimore Zionist District. At its core, the BZD's mission is to stand with Israel and support her, connect our community and beyond to the land, the people, the culture that we all love, that we fight for, and in our hearts know is our home. We are delighted to be here in person in the midst of what seems like the most extended 2 years of our lives. During this time, Israel has been through a pandemic, 4 elections, a government change, a war with Gaza, over 4,000 missiles hit, daily bashings on social media, an ice cream war, Iron Dome defunding and funding. And through it all, Israel and Israelis thrive and survive. And here in the diaspora, the pro-Israel Jewish communities and yourselves continue to fight for our brothers and our sisters back at home.
So, that being said, let's get underway. The first question, and we'll start with Minister Ben-Haim for her answer. The first question is as follows. We're now 9 months into the Biden administration, 3 months into the Bennett administration. How would you characterize the U.S.-Israel relationship, and to what extent, if any, is the relationship different from what it was under President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
To characterize the U.S.-Israel relationship, or Israel-U.S. as we see it, it's as it has always been, a very, very strong allyship. The United States is Israel's #1 ally and friend and supporter. And throughout the years, you know, from from 1948, you know, when President Truman was the first person to recognize the state of Israel until today, this very moment. All of Israeli leadership, government, people realize the importance of this relationship, the importance of this allyship, and are doing all they can. Obviously, each one sees it a little differently and may work a little differently, but the understanding that we need the U.S., and with the years that are going by, also the United States needs Israel, is growing and growing, and I think everybody's doing everything they think is the most correct thing to keep fostering and growing this, this relationship. We've all, you know, just to mention also, let's not forget the United States role, whether it was Carter's role in '79 with the peace in Egypt, and President Clinton's role in '94 with Jordan, and obviously President Trump's role with the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements in 2020. And now we see the Biden administration referring to it and continuing this path, you know, to hopefully get more countries involved in these, whether it's called Abraham Accords or normalization, but trying to change the face of the Middle East with the realization that Israel, whenever it faced the opportunity to have a normal relationship with a country or have a peace agreement, has never said no, because it's the benefit, one, for Israel, for those countries who do the agreements, for the region, and in a bigger picture, also good, going back to the U.S. and the international arena to have a stable, quiet, surviving Middle East. So basically, so yeah, so I think all the relationships have been good. Again, as a rabbi said, not always agreements, and at times disagreements, but I don't think that detracts from the basis of this relationship. But it's not only that. The U.S. and Israel do share a lot of core common values. Both are democracies. Again, we can talk later if you want about maybe challenges to these democracies, but both are democracies at the core. Both have the same intrinsic understanding, the need of human rights, of getting different communities within your country to be part of the country, whether part of the economic market, part of the education, but trying to gather all the different parts into this whole working nation. And we see now a lot also with the new administration, the issue of the climate crisis and the environment. Israel, a bit of a necessity, has been a leader in this front, whether they meant to or not, especially in the field of water. The Middle East is lacking. There is no water. Also, by the way, we're one of the most vulnerable areas that, to this climate crisis, and we can get into that later. But basically what Israel was able to do was develop these technologies to reuse water, to desalinate water, to have almost waterless or very, very little water agriculture. So it was able to get out of the water crisis or issue in the Middle East. Israel is no longer a player in the water war. And we see all over the world, one, what lack of water can cause. We see what happened in Syria now for the past 10 years. A lot of it, and we see it now, is due to the fact that it had no water resources to distribute among the people. That's part of it. And if they ever do go back, can they go back now that there's no water and no land for agriculture? But Israel is able to, with this, also help, again, the U.S. areas like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and others that are suffering from water challenges. So again, it is a two-sided relationship. It's not all just Israel take or Israel do. It is also important for the other side. And Karen, I think, mentioned the Iron Dome. You know, Iron Dome is the technology is able and is used by the U.S. military. So again, obviously it defends Israeli lives, civilian lives in Israel, Muslim, Jewish, and any other life that's there. But it is also, and will be, and is being used by the American military. About just a little bit about these days, our Prime Minister Bennett, was here for a very successful visit. You know, he met with President Biden and everybody else. This week we have our Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, coming as well to continue. And if you missed it yesterday, Secretary Blinken announced that there will be a trilateral meeting between Secretary Blinken, our Foreign Minister, and the Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates. which goes back to show that this relationship and the understanding of doing things together goes across administrations. They're not saying, oh, it was the previous administration, we'll stop it, we'll do other things. They understand the importance of it to Israel, to the region, and they're continuing with this. And I think it means a lot. Obviously, it's not disagreements. There are international challenges and threats to Israel, such as Iran, which we might think you need to deal with differently, whether you go back to the JCPOA, to the agreement, the international agreement that was signed in 2015 with Iran, or whether you need to change it. But disagreements are allowed. Disagreements are okay, as long as you do talk it out, as long as there is a partner that will listen and say and figure out what to do its best. But it is an existential threat to Israel. And by the way, not just to Israel. Also, I don't know if existential, but it's definitely a threat to other countries in the region and bigger. And as their arsenal grows, it will be a challenge and a threat to other countries as well. I think that's more or less for the beginning answer, at least. Yeah, we have the shared values. We have definitely a lot that has been done by the U.S. through the years, whether it's supplying us, Nixon in '67 and others during wars, emergency assistance during wars, and we saw, and Congress did come around to give us what we needed, the $1 billion for the Iron Dome 10 days ago about. So the relationship has known strifes, has known crises, but in a whole, and I think it is a blanket statement, but it's correct to say it has been a good understanding and allyship really from the moment that Israel was created.
Thank you, Tammy. You hit on a lot of issues that we'll be following up on throughout the program. I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Shanzer for his take on the U.S.-Israel relationship today in 2021.
Okay, thank you very much. Great to be with everybody today. I had the opportunity to visit Israel in June. It was my first international travel during the COVID crisis. And I think I sort of caught the last remaining window. When I arrived, nobody was wearing a mask. Everybody said, do whatever you want. It's Israel. We're vaccinated. Literally 9 days later, the day before I got back on the plane, everybody was masked again, and they were starting to reimpose restrictions. And I sort of had just a feeling that I was extremely lucky to have had the 10 days that I did. When I was there, I had two really interesting meetings that that really kind of focused my attention on the U.S.-Israel relationship. One was with someone from Yair Lapid's office, and he had told me, keep an eye out for tomorrow. We're about to sign a remarkable letter that I think you're going to appreciate. I've been a critic of the way that Israel has, well, let's just say, has had a hard time trying to decouple from China as the United States has started to focus on this challenge from Beijing. And what happened was Israel signed a letter condemning China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. And I was asked, hey, well, what do you think? And I said, well, it's fine, but I don't know what you thought you were going to get from it other than condemning the country that is accountable for roughly 10 to 15% of your GDP. Are you prepared for the fallout? And needless to say, the statement didn't quite get the benefit for Israel that it had hoped. The other interesting meeting that I had was actually with other folks from the MFA, and they were talking about how the FBI had come for an exchange on counterterrorism. And they recounted to me how strange it was, because usually the conversation would be about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hamas. And I heard that during this discussion, the FBI gave them a 30-minute lecture on domestic extremism here in the United States, to which my Israeli counterpart said, what are we supposed to do with that? And it kind of just dawned on me that we're at a weird moment in the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's not a bad one, but it's a weird one. So sort of think back in the 1950s, actually in 1950, the Israelis threw their lot with the United States and supported the United States in its Cold War with the Soviets. And that lasted through 1989, 1990. Then came the moment where the United States and Israel were working together closely in the peace process. And that went from roughly 1990 to 2001. And then that imploded, but just in the nick of time, there became this sort of new paradigm that emerged, and that was the fight against international terrorism. And Israel was in a terrific place to work with the United States and, in fact, teach the United States how to conduct this war. And then it all sort of got weird, starting with the Obama administration. And I would say that for those 8 years, it was marked by tension. Then you had another 4 years where it was marked by a bromance between Trump and Bibi. And now we are in no man's land. Now, if I would describe kind of in one word what's going on right now in the U.S.-Israel relationship, it's pragmatism. I think that's probably the best way of describing it. It's not necessarily warm. It's not cold either. It's an attempt to get back to whatever we're looking for, which is that alliance structure, that needed paradigm that we've had in the past and don't quite have right now. So I'll give you 4 acronyms right now that sum up the pragmatism of the U.S.-Israel relationship. One is ABB, anybody but Bibi. That's the first acronym. Number 2, JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the discussion over the Iran nuclear deal. Number 3, WBW, the war between wars that Israel is fighting against Iran in an asymmetric fashion. And then the 4th one, and this is maybe just an umbrella, but AOC, another just a shorthand for what's going on with the Squad, or as I think is probably more appropriate, the Hamas caucus in Congress. Now, ABB, I think, is I think it speaks for itself, but basically you have right now 2 leaders that are willing to work together, even if they don't love each other, even if they don't know each other, it doesn't matter, right? The reason why they're working closely together is neither wants the return of Bibi Netanyahu. And this is driving so much of what is happening right now between Jerusalem and Washington. I can't really express how strongly this is the current that drives everything. Bennett wants to stay in power. By the way, so does Lapid. He'd like to have his turn when Bennett leaves. And then on top of that, you've got Biden, who has worked with Bibi and has a good working relationship with him over the years, but would really rather not have Bibi come back. Okay, and so this is driving a lot of the pragmatism right now. It's not warmth. It's, okay, we have a common objective, let's work to that, but it's also not strategic. Like, it's not about fighting communism or terrorism or achieving peace. It's like, let's just keep working together. Then the second thing is JCPOA. Look, on there, the debate continues. I think there is a determined effort right now on the part of both leaders to not get down in the dirt the way that they did during the Bibi era primarily, right? Let's not make this personal. Let's keep working to arrive at solutions. Now, for the United States, there's not a lot of flexibility there. I got to say, you know, the White House is intent upon getting back in, and we see the position of Rob Malley in particular. This is the envoy to the Iran nuclear process, and I think the fact that he's even there has really rubbed the Israelis the wrong way. From Israel's perspective, though, the goal is to try to improve whatever America does on the margins. In other words, if you can improve things by 1% here or 5% there, make it harder for the Iranians to break out and also make it harder for them to achieve the sanctions relief that they're looking for, then Israel's done its job. The problem has been, and this was an interesting debate when I was in Israel in June, that the Israelis don't want to endorse anything that's going on diplomatically. So in other words, if they go in and they say, okay, America, these are our pieces of advice for you to take, it's going to look like the Israelis just gave it like a hechsher, right? That they're koshering the JCPOA, which in Israel's view is treif, right? So they're having a hard time figuring out how to do that, and it's been a dance. But from what I understand from officials that have been here very recently, it's moving in the right direction, but it is still very tense, but again, very pragmatic. Then the WBW, as I mentioned, the war between wars. Israel I think probably more than anything, really needs the United States to give a green light to what they're doing around the region. And when I say what they're doing, it means bombing Syria and taking out weapons that are destined for Hezbollah, cyber attacks against Iran's nuclear facilities, attacks against naval vessels in the Persian Gulf. These things Israel is doing as a means to weaken Iran and to bleed it. Death by 1,000 cuts while the sanctions are still in place. And from what I can tell, the United States has no issue with this. And I would say that this is probably one of the best testaments to the relationship, that Israel still has that freedom of action. Israel doesn't ask for permission to do these things, but they do know that they can sometimes cross a line or get in trouble with different administrations, and that's not the case right now with Biden. I would say full credit to this administration for that. And then I'll end with the Hamas caucus. This, I would say, is probably one of the greatest challenges that we have seen in quite some time. And look, it's not new. We've seen Republicans get this way in the past. I don't know if anybody remembers Paul Findley from the 1980s. He called himself Arafat's best friend in Congress and went after Israel at every opportunity, decrying the Israel lobby, etc. I think the squad or the Hamas caucus is more damaging than Findley ever was. I think he's smiling from the grave. He died last year, actually.
And TikTok.
What's that?
There wasn't TikTok back then.
Yeah, there was not TikTok back then. There was no Twitter back then. There was no Facebook. So, you know, the squad has the ability to get a bigger megaphone. Tammy's 100% right. But what really concerns me right now is, even in this pragmatic place where Israel's looking for, you know, opportunities to define the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship, the president is still a little bit on the fence with how to handle this. I'll give you this quick anecdote. During the Gaza war, for 9 days out of 11, Biden was terrific. Gave Israel all the cover that it needed, fended off the UN, fended off the squad, fended off everybody. He gave Israel the right to defend itself, which it has. Then we heard about a Gaza ceasefire that had been brokered by Egypt on day 9. And we knew that it was going to come into effect 48 hours later. And it was at that moment that Biden began to talk tough to Israel. He told Bibi he's done screwing around, that he needs to end this war. The war was going to end, and he knew it. And so what he did is he cashed a blank check provided by the Egyptians so that he could begin to slap Israel around in a public way. And it was not for him. It was for domestic consumption in Brooklyn and in Berkeley, okay? He did that because he knew that he needed to cover his left flank. And so the politics continues to play a very dangerous role in all of this. But this is all to say that things are still okay. They're still pragmatic, and they're still working towards a new paradigm, but they need that new paradigm soon, whether it's fighting against Russia, whether it's environment, whether it's, you know, war on terror, whatever it is, there needs to be something, some glue to hold this together in a more strategic way, because right now it feels like we're in between paradigms. I'll end there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ben Samuels, what do you think about the current state of the relationship?
Well, I agree with a lot of what my fellow panelists said, and I disagree with a lot of what my fellow panelists said, and that's totally okay. I want to start out by just pointing out one small example which illustrates a bigger problem. So no one talked about defunding Iron Dome the past few weeks. When the whole scandal erupted, it was about whether or not the United States would provide an additional $1 billion in aid that Israel had requested. So America gives over $3 billion a year in military aid per the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu government. $500 million of that specifically goes to Iron Dome. So after the Gaza war, because Hamas used this new strategy of just trying to overload the Iron Dome, and just the quantity of the rockets was unlike anything that has been seen in past military flare-ups, that Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system stockpile was depleted. So Israel needed $1 billion as soon as possible to replenish that stockpile because Hamas saw that strategy worked. And Hamas can reproduce these rockets for very cheap, and these missile interceptors that Israel uses, they're very technologically advanced, but they're very expensive to produce. So what Democratic leadership did was that they attached this additional $1 billion into the stopgap funding bill that they were trying to pass in order to keep the government afloat for the next few months. So what the House Progressives, or the Hamas caucus, as my fellow panelist likes to call them, what they objected to was the lack of transparency and the lack of debate. It wasn't about providing military aid to Israel. They do take into question whether or not Israel should be provided $1 billion in military aid every year, and whether or not that needs to be thought about, whether that's in the United States' best interest, but that's not what the recent argument was about. So I think it points to a bigger issue, that the nuance of these objections, and there is nuance to it, that's very important. These are not, some of the rhetoric does traffic and veer into anti-Semitism at times, but these are not inherently anti-Semitic positions. It is okay to be critical of Israeli policy, and that does not make you a hater of Jews. That is extremely important for all of us to understand. That is extremely important to move forward with this debate. Because the second we resort to ad hominem attacks, and the second that we just assume the worst base interests in all of these people, we get nowhere. So it points to a bigger issue about the so-called democratic divide about Israel. Only 9 House members objected to the standalone bill. The people that went on record explaining why they objected to it, they said it was because of the lack of transparency. They said it's because where is this $1 billion going to come from? Are you just going to pull it out of a hat? And by the way, this $1 billion in aid is currently being held up by a Republican in the Senate. It's not a Democrat. It's not a squad member. It's not a so-called Israel hater. It is a fiscal conservative isolationist who wants to, well, he's arguing that this money should be reallocated from Afghanistan reconstruction aid, but he's also arguing, where are you going to get $1 billion from? You know, no one's calling him an anti-Semite. No one's calling him a Jew hater. So I think it's important to understand the damage that Benjamin Netanyahu did to the bipartisan standing of Israel in Washington over the past 15, 20 years. And I agree with Jonathan in the sense that right now, both the Bennett government and the Biden administration are really trying to put the pieces back together, and they are trying to both pursue a policy of do no harm. They are trying to make it seem that everything is okay, that nothing is shaken, that it's unshakable, unbreakable, bipartisan. And, you know, you talk to the more liberal Democrats who aren't part of this, you know, far left progressive movement, they maintain that the democratic support for Israel has not changed. It's the Israeli government that's moved further to the right. So the center of gravity of the debate has shifted. And I think that's very important to understand, that the Democrats overall, as a party, they are maintaining the same policies that they've had for the past 25 years. So, you know, is the relationship still strong? Yes, it's as strong as it's been. But you can't overlook the fact that, you know, the debate is shifting, and the debate is shifting for real reasons. And until the American government, whether it's Congress, whether it's the White House, whether it's the State Department, until they proactively engage with the Palestinian issue, you can talk about climate change, you can talk about desalination, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about, you're not going to get them to take their eye off the ball. You have to deal with the Palestinian issue. It's not going anywhere. And the administration is very hesitant to do this right now because the situation on the ground is just not ripe for improvement at the moment. So you hear the Bennett government talking about shrinking the conflict and pursuing economic peace and bolstering the Palestinian private sector, which is something that we'll probably get into when we talk about the Abraham Accords and how the United States and how Israel and how further countries can further boost this. Improving the Palestinian sector is something that everyone is interested in. It's something that Israeli defense officials say is extremely important as well. It's not just AOC, it's not Ilhan Omar. This is something that Israeli officials understand to be true. So until you actually proactively engage with the Palestinian issue, the rest is bells and whistles. So if I leave you with one thing, We need to stop the ad hominem attacks. We need to improve the rhetoric. We need to raise the level of debate on this, and that's what I got to say.
Thank you, Ben. Michael?
Thank you. I would like to leave you also with just, well, I would like to leave you with three things that I think are the most important things to remember. And they are Iran, Iran, and Iran. And everything else is commentary. The key issue, I think there's a habitual mistake that American Jews make when they evaluate American policies toward Israel, is they assume that the issue is Israel and the Jews. And so, for example, when you see that the Biden administration gave Israel basically 10 days to take care of Hamas, there was a kind of feeling of relief that went through the American Jewish community. People said, "Oh, it's not as bad as we thought. He's really not anti-Israel." But Barack Obama did the same thing. Gave Israel time to take care of Hamas during the Gaza conflict of his day. The key issue is not what's the attitude toward Israel, but what is the American attitude about regional order, and how does Israel fit in that regional order? And in that regard, I see the Biden administration as the third term of Barack Obama. It's not quite as good at implementing Obama's vision as Obama was, because the guy at the top is not as good as Obama was. But the vision is basically the same. The United States is pulling back, and it's looking for an accommodation with Iran, and not simply on the JCPOA, but all around the region. Everywhere that Iran is on the move, that means Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the administration is accommodating it. And this is now becoming, now this is becoming part of the general understanding that you see in even the press that is sympathetic to the Democrats. For example, just a day or two ago, Josh Rogan, writing in the Washington Post, said, I had it right here 1 second ago, that this is the headline of his article: Biden is tacitly endorsing Assad's normalization. But Assad being the best ally of Iran in the Arab world. They don't admit it openly. They don't say we're normalizing relations with Assad, but they're normalizing relations with Assad. The key is, in each one of these arenas, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the administration has developed a language for accommodating Iran that doesn't mention Iran. They call for de-escalation, diplomacy, dialogue. They call for humanitarianism. There's a whole thing now about we have to save Lebanon. Poor Lebanon, we have to save it. Lebanon is being destroyed by Hezbollah, but we have to save it. We have to pump money into Lebanon. If you pump money into Lebanon, you're building up Hezbollah. If you pump money, if you relieve the sanctions on Assad, you're building up the Iranian alliance system. They know they're doing it. They're not stupid. They're not silly. They're not uninformed. They're not inexperienced. They're not bad negotiators. They're accommodating Iran. That's what they're doing. So the Biden administration can give Israel 10 days in Gaza because it doesn't really affect what is their strategic purpose, which is to cut the deal with Iran. The key sentence from the Gaza conflict that everyone should remember is when Anthony Blinken was asked point blank, isn't it true that Iran is arming Hamas? He said, oh, I don't know anything about that. Are you kidding me? He doesn't know anything about that. The one thing that the United States can do well with its intelligence is understand things like that. Of course he knows that. But he doesn't want to say that because the negotiations over the JCPOA were ongoing, and he doesn't want to scuttle them. And that's the key question, and that's what's hanging over the U.S.-Israeli relations right now. Now, a few words about that. Each one of the leaders, Bennett and Lapid in Israel, and Biden in the United States, each one is haunted by somebody else. Bennett is haunted by Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is saying publicly that the Bennett government, well, he calls it the Lapid-Bennett government, since Lapid has more seats than Bennett, and since Bennett betrayed him in his views, he likes to insult Bennett by saying the Lapid-Bennett government. I actually find it really funny because it's more true than not. But anyway, I can see nobody else finds it funny. Let me try again. The Lapid-Bennett government. But if I keep saying it, it'll get funny. But I won't know if you're laughing with me or at me. Anyway, he says Netanyahu accuses the Bennett government of having adopted an agreement of no surprises with Biden over Iran. Now, Bennett vehemently denies that there is such an agreement. No surprises, meaning we, the Israelis, are going to give the Americans veto power over our operations, whether they're clandestine operations in Iran or operations against Iranian forces or proxies around the region. We're going to give the Americans veto power over it ahead of time. Now, Bennett denies it. I actually think that Bennett is probably, in a completely literal sense, Bennett has the better argument here. He probably has not come to such an agreement with Biden. However, the power relations are such that there is an informal agreement of that kind. He knows that if he carries, and you can just see that the ops tempo. Remember all of those nuclear facilities in Iran that were blowing up mysteriously. It stopped. It stopped. It stopped for one of two reasons, which is the same reason. Either those operations were solely Israeli operations, and the Israelis aren't conducting them now because they know it will annoy the Americans to no end. At a moment when they are trying to reach a deal with the Iranians, or they were joint American-Israeli operations, and the Americans have stopped them because they're trying to get a deal with the Iranians. And Bennett knows that if that ops tempo increases, he's going to have a big problem with Biden, which means that Biden might then, and he cannot afford to have bad relations with Biden, because this government is not going to last very long. I mean, who knows? It's politics. You can never tell. It could last forever. But everyone must assume that this government is not going to last very long. These guys, Bennett betrayed his own right-wing base. Bennett is more right-wing than Bibi Netanyahu by every measure of right-wing in Israeli politics. But he's dying to be the successor of Netanyahu as the kind of right-of-center figure who can pull together the whole coalition from settlers to just the secular center. You know, they joke in Israel about the ever-shrinking kippah of Naftali Bennett, because he was part of he was on the national religious right, and now he's moving centrist, and his kippah is getting smaller and smaller and put further and further back. You can't see it anymore. He wants to be Netanyahu's successor, but he betrayed the right-wing electorate in order to be the head of this government that is either left or is either center-left or far left. One of the major arguments that he and Lapid as well want to make in the next election is that they improved relations with the United States. It's extremely important for them to be able to make that argument. So they're claiming that it was Bibi Netanyahu who ruined the relations with the Americans, because Netanyahu yoked the Israeli cart to the Republican, even the Trumpist horse, and that if only we had been more pragmatic and sat down and made our case better and in a more respectful manner with the Obama administration. And if Netanyahu hadn't come and made a speech before both houses of Congress, then everything would be fantastic with the Americans. And we could have actually changed the nature of the JCPOA because our voice would have been part of the argument then. That's all nonsense. It's all absolute nonsense because America decided to, the Democrats decided to go for a deal with the Iranians, regardless of what the Israelis said. They knew the Israelis were going to be apoplectic about it. That's why they started the negotiations without telling the Israelis. So the Israelis are not responsible for the fact that the Hamas caucus is now as powerful as it is in democratic politics. That's a huge change in American society, the rise of the progressives and so on. The Jews don't have control over that. As powerful as you are, you didn't make that happen. So it's all nonsensical, but they have to sell it to the Israeli electorate. And in order to sell it to the Israeli electorate, they have to keep good relations with the Americans. There's a similar dynamic going on. I just basically described it, but quickly, and then I'll stop, about a related dynamic going on the American side with Biden. Biden won the election in electoral college terms by 44,000 votes distributed across 3 states. That's an incredibly thin margin, thinner than the one by which Trump beat Hillary. He has got to, he goes to bed every night. If Naftali Bennett goes to bed every night worried about Netanyahu, Biden goes to bed every night worried about Trump and Trump's coalition. That's why you'll notice in the Afghan withdrawal, there was a lot of, all the rhetoric coming out of Biden's mouth was stolen out of Trump's playbook. There was Donald Trump's America First rhetoric coming out of Joe Biden, because Biden needs a segment of that Trump coalition, and he needs at the same time to keep the progressives on board, in order to defeat the Trump coalition or whatever manifestation of it he's going to face, the Democrats are going to face in the next election. And that's where the Trump America First coalition and the progressives, where they come together, is pulling back the United States from the region. And the Democratic answer about how you pull America back and stop military interventions is cut a deal with Iran. It's central to their strategic thinking. There's no argument Naftali Bennett or Netanyahu or anyone else can make that is going to make them change that calculation. And so they're kidding themselves when they say it. Now, there's a smart Israeli answer to all this, which I have put to some Israeli officials. And they say, of course we know this, Mike. Of course we know this. Of course they don't, but they have to know everything. Of course we know, but we have to maintain decent relations with them. And so, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. That sort of thing. That's all fine and good, but you can't tell me that they're not staying their hand. They're staying their hand. They're not carrying out operations against Iran's nuclear facilities. They're not carrying out operations against Iran around the region. They didn't blow up the Hamas, the Iranian shipments of oil to Lebanon. They're playing nice in order to manage in order to manage Biden, and it's a long-term problem because Iran is continuing forward on its nuclear program. So to end, I would say my message is, don't be fooled by the lies. They're dishonest. They know they're being dishonest, disingenuous, engaging in misdirection. However you want to say it. They're not telling you what they're really doing, and they know what they're really doing. It's great, wonderful that Bennett is going to sit down. Blinken is going to sit down with Lapid and the UAE foreign minister and celebrate the Abraham Accords. But the Abraham Accords they're celebrating is not the Abraham Accords that we applauded. The Abraham Accords that we applauded was a coalition being put together by the United States and its allies to defeat Iran. And the goal was to bring, there was the Sudan, there was the UAE, there was Bahrain, there was Morocco. Those are all allies of Saudi Arabia. The goal was to pull Saudi Arabia in and to have normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That is the last thing that Biden wants. The last thing that he wants, because if Israel and Saudi Arabia get together, they're going to make plans about how to influence the United States to stick it to Iran. And they don't want to stick it to Iran. That's the whole plan. So don't be fooled. There's no continuity between Trump and Biden on the Abraham Accords. They're going to celebrate UAE and Israel having economic relations. That's great, economic normalization. I'm all in favor of it. But the most important thing is to go after Iran, and these guys are never going to do it.
Thank you to our panel for your insight on that question. And actually, my next question goes to Michael's last point, and maybe we can have our other panelists talk about it. It has been about a year since the execution of the Abraham Accords and the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. What are the prospects for other countries to join the list, particularly Saudi Arabia? And is there anything that either the Biden administration or the Bennett government can do to make that happen?
Sure. Okay. So a couple of things that I think are worth noting. One is on the big test of the Abraham Accords. I was personally concerned during the Gaza war that it all might collapse, right? I mean, here you have the Arab world looking at video, at pictures of Israel bombing Gaza, and without context, of course, right? I mean, in the Arab world, I was watching Arabic language television from my home, watching Al Arabiya, watching Palestine TV. By the way, Apple TV is amazing for those apps, for anybody interested in just seeing what they're watching on the other side of the world. Also some terrific Israeli channels as well. But at any rate, you know, there was this moment where I think we thought they were all going to be canceled, every one of those agreements. And in fact, there was a bit of a hashtag war that was taking place on Twitter and on Facebook, and you know, you could see the battle for public opinion taking place in real time in Arabic media, and Israel came out okay. The agreements came out okay. I don't want to say that it was lovely. I don't want to say that the UAE or Morocco or Sudan said, great job bombing Gaza, guys, keep it up, let's do it again next year. That was definitely not the message, but there was a sense of, look, Israel's defending itself, this is a challenge, but probably more importantly, it was a realization that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not the key issue any longer for these Arab states. It's still an issue. They'd like to see a Palestinian state one day, but they also know that they cannot make this the sword that they fall upon. And they know it, and they've acquiesced to it. And so we've passed the first test. They're still strong, these agreements. They're not going to collapse, and that was huge. Second thing is there was a test at home. And the test at home here was the Biden administration didn't want to even acknowledge that there was such a thing as the Abraham Accords. There's this classic video, you can find it on YouTube, of Ned Price being asked to describe, what do you call those agreements again? Oh, normalization agreements. No, but what was the proper noun? Normalization agreements. They wouldn't even say the Abraham Accords. It was like he couldn't get himself to say that because it was a recognition of something that the Trump administration had done. And after, I would say, a battle that was waged, finally, the administration marked the 1 year, and they're calling it the Abraham Accords. So it was a big moment on this side that they were at least willing to embrace it. But I agree with Mike. Oh, and by the way, just the optics of that is just silly. The idea that, I mean, just imagine Ronald Reagan not wanting to acknowledge the Camp David Accords and not wanting to call it the Camp David Accords because Jimmy Carter had brokered them. It's a terrible look, especially when you're talking about peace. I mean, just, I can't stress enough how bad those optics were for the White House, and I'm glad they came out on the other side. But I think to Mike's point, the big fish right now, moving forward, is Saudi. I mean, you could get Oman, and you could have maybe, I don't know, Indonesia, or a couple of, I don't know. There have been a couple of countries that where, even Kuwait, they've thrown around, the Qataris maybe. But Saudi Arabia is the big fish here. Saudis, they were the ones that were on the cusp. And I've been to Saudi Arabia a couple of times, and you could tell they were kind of openly flirting with this idea. But if you look at the policy of this administration, it is diplomatic arson right now with the Saudis, right? Whether it's the revocation of the designation of the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's the release of information relating to the Khashoggi murder, brutal as it was, we already knew all of those facts. They were all out there, right? This idea of declassifying information about Saudi Arabia's possible involvement in 9/11, what they're doing right now, this administration, is they're making it harder and harder for the Saudis to want to do anything that would please the United States. They are driving a wedge, and that wedge is going to make it a lot harder for that normalization agreement to occur. And so my guess is we don't see anything for another 3 to 7 years, depending on how elections go. Because, and again, I talked about before how the Biden administration is catering to the desires of the Hamas caucus. That wedge with Saudi Arabia is one of the big ones. That's one of their demands. And it's been that way for a long time. So I would say that the idea that we might push things further along on the normalization front, it's highly unlikely if your goal is trying to attract Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so first let me just say, if Jonathan says something is brewing or not brewing, you should probably take his word for it. Very few people are more plugged into normalization and the developments than he is, so take that. In terms of the battle of calling it the Abraham Accords or calling it normalization, I think there's a tendency to get a little too tied up in the battle over semantics rather than actually understanding the policy that lies behind it. So, maybe the Biden administration was hesitant to call it the Abraham Accords because they didn't want to assign a biblical meaning to it or whatever. Maybe it was because they thought it was too closely associated with Trump. Whatever it is, I think it points to the bigger issue that the Biden administration had with the Abraham Accords, in that the way Trump went about recruiting partners to it. So there's sort of a joke that a lot of the states came with a grocery list to Jared Kushner and to Avi Berkowitz and to the Trump administration. They'd say, okay, what do you want? You want F-35s and Reaper drones? Here you go. You want the United States to be one of 2 countries in the world to recognize an occupation of the Western Sahara? There you go. You want us to remove Sudan from the anti-terror list, from the international terrorism list, when it's most likely very premature to do that? Sure. So I think the Biden administration was hesitant to pick up where Trump left off with that. And not only that, but I think there was too much of a tendency to treat these normalization accords as a separate piece. And I think people like John Kerry were very clearly proven wrong, where he said that there will never be normalization with these Arab states until there is peace between the Israeli Palestinians. That was obviously being proven wrong. But it doesn't take away from the general point that until Israel deals with the Palestinians, that there is very much a ceiling on how far these normalization accords can go. That doesn't mean that there can't be flourishing ties, whether it's tourism or technological development or financial ties or private sector development. That is all well and good. But until Israel deals with Palestinians, until there is significant movement on that front, there is very much a limit and a ceiling to how far these can go.
Look at it. Here's the choice that the administration has made. Whether we were, the Trump administration got us to a point where we were at the brink of a significant improvement in Saudi-Israeli relations. We know that there's been, over the last decade, a very significant improvement in Saudi-Israeli relations, but it's mainly been beneath the surface. It was going to come out and be on the surface. Was there going to be actual normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel? Who knows? If it wasn't normalization, it was going to be some kind of significant public expression of a new relationship. So here you have the country that 2 million Muslims make pilgrimage to every year, and that all Muslims bow down and pray toward every year, on the verge of normalizing relations with the Jewish state. That is a historic change of the greatest importance for the Jewish state, for the Jews, for relations between Jews and Muslims, but also for everybody else, and for Christians and every other non-Muslim with relations with the Muslims. It's a whole different understanding of Islam in the modern world when that happens. It has reverberations all the way to Indonesia, from Morocco to Indonesia. The alternative was, which the Biden administration chose, let's try to make improve relations between the United States and the biggest sponsor of terror and Islamic extremism in the world, and let's do it without demanding that sponsor of terrorism and extremism end any of that. Because we'll do it on the basis on the basis of a narrow agreement about Iran's nuclear program. We'll pretend that it's just about the nuclear program, and we'll start turning a blind eye to everything else that they're doing in the region. And they are all of the worst actors in the Middle East are either their direct allies or proxies, or they are moving in the same direction strategically as the Iranians. The Biden administration chose that. That's the choice they made, and that's the key issue. And I agree with every word that Jonathan said about the Saudi question. They're trying to drive a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's not just that they would prefer to do the Palestinian track first. The strategic goal is to drive a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because a strong Saudi-Israeli relationship will make it impossible for them to achieve their misguided strategic goal of finding a strategic accommodation with Iran.
We've been talking about the strategic goals of the United States. There are commentators that are saying that, particularly given the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that we're actually in an era of contracting American power and influence in the Middle East. Do you agree with that characterization? And if that's what's happening, is that a positive or negative development for Israel?
So, yes and no. I mean, I think it's clear that the administration very much is operating from a foreign policy standpoint, kind of as Jonathan alluded to at the beginning, that China is very much where their strategic focus is on the macro level. That doesn't mean that Israel's going to be left out in the cold. America has committed to ensuring that Israel has a qualitative military edge. That's not going to go anywhere. Whether or not the administration finds itself being drawn back into dealing with the Middle East as its primary foreign policy matter, I don't think that'll happen. But at the end of the day, Israel is still a very geopolitically strategic, important ally. America is committed to this sort of level of significance that Israel has. The qualitative military edge isn't going anywhere for the next 2 years, so I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Yeah, I'll just strengthen what you're saying. Exactly. Israel has never counted on the U.S. being boots on the ground or guarding it or safeguarding it. We've counted on different issues, right? Counterterrorism, intelligence, technology sharing, doing things together. But it's not as though Israel had needed or ever asked for the U.S. having boots on the ground, and as opposed to other places. So I agree with you. I don't think the difference would be much bigger. Yeah, okay, I won't. I was going to say something about Iran again, but I won't for this. No, I think also, yeah. I'm not talking about the region, but for Israel, I don't think it will make a difference.
I would just say this. I'm not sure if it matters 100% or even 1% for Israel. Israel is going to defend itself by itself, and that's what it takes pride in doing. So there is probably, the impact on Israel is probably negligible when you think about the United States leaving Afghanistan. But let me just broaden out for a second, because I think this is so important, and I think it's not being addressed directly these days. There is a trend right now in American politics that I will call neo-isolationism. It is the revival of Charles Lindbergh in the lead up to World War II. this idea that America doesn't have a role to play in fighting bad actors around the world, in combating whether it's fascism or maybe radical Islam out of Iran, or you name it, fill in the blank, whatever the dangers are that are looming. And there is, I would say, a lot at stake right now as the United States debates its place in the world. You can say whatever you want about the US-led world order and the mistakes that have been made in recent years about the invasion of Iraq or our war on terror. But if you look macro, the US-led world order has led to unprecedented growth in the economy, in technology, in medicine, in democracy, in the betterment of billions of people around the world. And right now, the United States is not sure whether it wants to continue down that road. And the United States is not sure that it even matters. And you see Americans, you see certainly people abroad questioning whether that US-led world order was a positive thing. Now, I don't really understand that ahistoric view, first of all. But I think more importantly, the question is, what happens after this? Okay? And there I think there are massive implications for Israel, but not just Israel, every one of our allies around the world, and us. Okay? I mean, there was a moment, you know, where the sun set on the British Empire. Okay? The Brits managed their own decline, kind of like what it looks like we're doing right now. But I think humanity was incredibly fortunate because the United States was there to grab the baton and to keep going, okay? If we see the managed decline of the United States, which is what is really being discussed in some way or another right now, who takes the baton next? China. It's China. There is no doubt in my mind, there is no other Western power that is prepared to take the lead. Germany is on the decline, the Brits are in disarray after Brexit, the French have delusions of grandeur but are definitely not taking that baton. So we now have this moment where the United States needs to think very carefully. And I mean, to be very frank, this neo-isolationist trend, we saw it during Obama, we saw it during Trump, we see it now during Biden. I don't know whether it can be reversed, but I am extremely concerned, and again, not for Israel. Yes, for Israel maybe on some level, but it's about who's going to lead the world, who is going to set the tone for what comes next. And believe me, there are a lot of challenges that loom.
I'm actually very concerned about Israel, but I'm more concerned about the United States, but I'm concerned about both. There's a revolution has taken place in American foreign policy in the last year or so, but it's been a quiet revolution, and a lot of people have yet to notice, and that's that our leaders now recognize beyond a shadow of a doubt that if China decides to make a war in order to retake Taiwan, to go to war to retake Taiwan, we might, first of all, we might not engage in that war. If we do engage in that war, we might lose it, and that is a radical shift in our understanding of our position in the world. Since the end of the Soviet Union until yesterday, we were of the impression that we could insinuate ourselves, we could intervene militarily in any conflict in the world and become the dominant power rather quickly, and so and we would certainly control the air power in the conflict. We no longer believe that, and we realize that we have a competitor that in certain arenas is at least as powerful as we are. And that is leading to a multi-sided debate about how we should respond. And there are voices, as Jonathan said, who are just talking about withdrawal in general, but there are others who are talking about focusing on East Asia and abandoning the Middle East. And these are mainstream foreign policy voices, and I suspect that that behind the Biden administration's Iran engagement policy, there are people who are thinking exactly like that. Those were some of the arguments that were made about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Is we have to withdraw from Afghanistan because we have to focus on China. And notice the logic that followed immedately in train. All of a sudden, the Taliban, which had been our enemy in Afghanistan, was suddenly our partner in stabilizing, our partner in getting Americans out, our partners against the Islamic State, and this happened almost overnight. It's the same logic that's being applied to Iran. Iran, which has always been our adversary, suddenly we're going to turn it into our strategic partner. That logic leads to almost inevitably the United States leaving the Middle East, or at least not contending for it. Now, China has massive aspirations on the Middle East. The Middle East is the second most important region in the world to the Chinese. The first, of course, being its own neighborhood, the first island chain in East Asia. It's the second most important region because China is overwhelmingly dependent on energy that comes either from the Middle East or flows through the Middle East to get to China. Those supply lines are very vulnerable. Currently, it has to go through the Straits of Malacca, one of the narrowest, most crowded choke points in the world, and all of China's adversaries, including India and all of its East Asian adversaries, are dependent on Middle Eastern oil or oil that flows through the Middle East. So what China would like to do is flip and the problem for China is that the United States is the dominant power in the Middle East, so if there is a war in East Asia, its energy supplies are vulnerable. It would like to flip the ratio so that all of its adversaries, it has its finger on the choke point for all of its adversaries. Now, it'll be some years before it could get to that position. But if the United States ups and leaves the Middle East or continues to send this signal that it's not really willing to contend with what's going on in the Middle East, then the Chinese are going to insinuate themselves further and further into the region. They also have their eye especially on Israel, because their vision of becoming the dominant power in the world is dependent on being the leader in those high-tech industries that are going to determine economic and military dominance in the coming century. Israel is incredibly advanced in both the economic and the military dimensions of high tech. It has an incredible penetration of the American military complex as regards those issues, and so China has a target on the energy resources of the region and on Israel simultaneously. The bad news for Israel is the United States doesn't know what it's doing. It's confused, and it doesn't have a clear vision about its role in the Middle East. The good news for Israel is that Israel does fight its own wars. Israel does have a capable military, has a 4-star intelligence operation, and so on. And at a moment when the United States is having difficulty balancing the imperative from its own electorate not to intervene militarily in the region, but yet is also heeding the imperative of competing with China, it's going to need allies who have such capabilities. So Israel, if America adopts the correct understanding of how to maintain its position in the world, Israel can become the best ally of the United States in the next, and I mean the best ally of the United States, not just in the Middle East, but globally in the next century. But that's dependent on America adopting the right frame of understanding, because we might just make a mistake and pull out, and then we'll be in trouble.
I want to get to some more specific questions about internal politics of the United States, but one more follow-up on this general topic. I think there's a tendency still to perhaps view Israel as being this poor country, a weak country. Thank God Israel in 2021 is a regional military and economic superpower. Do we need to recalibrate how we think about Israel vis-a-vis the United States to take that into account? Does that mean that Israel is in fact less liable and less susceptible to American pressure, given its economic strength, given its military strength?
You know, my trip to Israel in June, I met with an official from what they call their J8, which is their Strategic Planning and Acquisition Division. And it was very clear to me that Israel plans on getting that $3.8
billion per year for the acquisition of the hardware that it needs in order to fight the battles of the future. And they think about it as something that is consistent and that is semi-permanent, if not completely permanent. I think the wake-up call that I think we got a couple of weeks ago has injected a debate. Maybe Tammy can speak a bit more to it. As I've watched the Israeli press, there are people like Michael Doran, former ambassador for Israel to the United States, who is now saying that Israel needs to restructure and rethink
this entire aid package because it cannot put itself at the whim of AOC and Bernie Sanders and the squad, the Hamas caucus, right? How do you leave yourself at the whim of this, especially as that caucus appears to be, look, it was 9 people, one abstention that was notable, that 100%, but the thing is that it's more acceptable now than it ever was to take these positions, and I will disagree respectfully with my colleague here. I think there is an anti-Semitic element to it. I do, with some of the rhetoric that we hear. And that if you hear it in some places, you can't put a firewall between what they say out on the street with their constituents and then not apply that to Israel, Israel being the only Jewish state. It's very hard to say that you don't have that bleed. And so I think there's an interesting debate. It will be one, I think, primarily driven by the Israelis, though. And we've seen some hawks on the Israeli side that don't want to divorce from the United States, but they do want to think more carefully about how reliant Israel has to be. So it might mean that some of that aid is redirected toward R&D, for example, or AI, or what we would call weapons of the future. And by the way, that would also begin to help some of, I think, what Mike was describing. You know, the Chinese are targeting Israel for technology. So if the United States invests heavily in Israel as the startup nation and says, we get first dibs at this technology and you can't give it to China because we're bankrolling it, then that might begin to address some of that tension there as well. But we'll have to see. I think we're going to see an evolutionary process. I think we're going to see steps taken away from this wholly dependent model to something that probably looks more hybrid. But I'd be interested to hear what Tammy says about what's happening in the Israeli debate. From what I've seen so far, it's been fascinating. Of course, you know, you put 2 Israelis in a room, you get 10 opinions.
Yeah.
This is exactly what's happening right now on the debate over aid.
And they change. But by the way, what we said about Israel becoming stronger and the relationship becoming maybe, I wouldn't say, you know, not the weak country that we're helping, but a little bit more balanced. The aid each year, a bigger and bigger percentage of the 3.8 is supposed to be purchased or used just in the U.S. So once the aid was, you know, it was given to Israel and the Israel military industries could develop with this money. Now it's all going back into the U.S. And I think at the 10th year, it will be, I want to say 100%, but if it's not, it's very close to 100% of the money actually being invested in the U.S. So that's a big issue here, and it also does show the strength and the understanding that Israel can assist and can help, as you said, with weapons of the future, with intelligence, with many other defensive systems as well, but with many other issues, and it's a little more balanced. And another thing you said, you're right. Israel is very, you know, is doing very, very well with high tech and innovation, a lot from necessity. Obviously, I've been not just, and you're right, not just environment, but also with, you know, everything from AI to night vision to drones to a lot of things. And these companies, a lot of these companies are private companies. They're looking for investors. Despite the realization that Israeli governments and their leadership despite disagreements, understand who the main ally of Israel is, who is the main supporter and who will be there. The U.S., a private company seeking investment, is open to take the investment from whoever is offering the most and is offering to be there and give the money. So we are facing maybe a changing issue where more thought needs to be given to how we do this and who does it, and how we can encourage maybe the U.S., Europeans, and other countries to invest first and invest the same amounts. But this is the way they work, and it is an issue that Israel will face, the U.S. and others. I'm trying, right? Going back, we have shared values and shared visions and understanding of democracy, human rights, and we share this. How we maintain this vision and the roles of the countries to pursue this vision and ensure this vision in the international arena in the coming years. And it will depend a lot on money, economy, and being in the region.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Israel would be very, very, very ill-advised to think that they could go at it alone without United States backing. I think, again, not to make it a black and white issue, I fully agree that some of the comments made by progressive lawmakers over the past several years have trafficked in anti-Semitism. There is no doubt about it. But there are many, many, many shades of gray in between that and other criticism of theirs. And that wide range of criticism really reflects a growing trend and a growing generational divide in how Americans view Israel. And you just can't look at it in a vacuum and say, these are the 7 anti-Semitic lawmakers that are critical of Israeli policy because they don't believe in the necessity of a Jewish state. It is not like that. Whether it's because they don't believe the United States taxpayer money should be going toward funding human rights violations, or whether it's because they have their own personal experience dealing with police brutality that they see parallels in on the streets of the West Bank. Whatever it is, they have their own reasons for it. And this really, and people relate to this, young voters relate to this. And pretending that that's not going to be an issue down the line and running away from that is only going to make that divide grow, and it's only going to put it further into the spotlight, and it only will serve to make Israel more vulnerable. So I really think Israel needs to truly reckon with where these criticisms are coming from, and obviously to combat the ones that are founded in hatred and founded in racism and founded in anti-Semitism, but the ones that aren't, to really understand what is being said and to try to understand how they can further strengthen that alliance with the United States, because Israel does need the United States. There's no argument to say that Israel doesn't need the United States.
I think it's very important for Israelis to understand where the progressive hatred of Israel is coming from. I believe that. But I don't think it's coming because they're concerned about human rights violations or alleged human rights violations in the West Bank. They focus on human rights violations in the West Bank and not those that happened in Iran for a reason. And that's because they hate Israel. They hate Israel for a reason. Sometimes it's anti-Semitism. But more importantly, I think it's very important to understand, it has nothing to do with Israel or Jews at all. It has everything to do with them, but in the first instance, it's got nothing to do with them. They hate Israel because they hate the pro-Israelis in the United States. They hate the evangelicals, they hate the American right, they hate those who are in favor of a muscular American foreign policy abroad. They hate those who, just like on the Trump right, they want a more isolationist foreign policy. That's where it all stems from. Israel is collateral damage for this struggle that's going on in our own society. I think the most important thing that those of us who support Israel can do is to make it clear that those who are carrying out a woke revolution in the United States are destroying the American position against China, and they are ensuring that the United States is going to lose the competition with China globally. If the United States picks up and leaves from the Middle East, which is where the woke vision of foreign policy leads, It means that China will get an enormous benefit in the competition with the United States globally for the reasons I mentioned before about the role that Middle Eastern energy plays in the East Asian competition and the role of Israel in the high-tech competition with the United States. The I don't know, what are we up to now? 3.8 million a year? $3.8 million a year. I'm sorry, billion. Yeah, and that's not million, is it? It's a billion. 3.8 billion. It might as well be 3.8 million because it's nothing when compared to the other. It's a matter of accounting, which says that 3.8 billion, most of which goes to American industries anyway, is a significant amount for the United States, which pays for the defense of Germany, which pays for the defense of Japan, and numerous other countries around the world. We don't talk about the enormous contributions, and many, many more than $3.8 billion a year, that the United States makes to the defense of Japan, because we don't do the accounting that way. But basically, we ensure the defense of Japan. So what we, the United States, are getting in return for that investment is way, way more than we are paying. And that's the important thing, I think, to remember when arguing with people on the woke left. You know, it's like we made a small investment a few years ago in a startup, and now we have Israel as a cyber superpower. I strongly disagree with Michael Oren, who thinks that if we just change the relationship a little bit with Israel, give Israel more independence, less strings, that is going to save Israel from the woke left. Because the woke left is not concerned about the accounting. It's not concerned. It's not concerned about this formal structure or that formal structure or this whatever issue it's making a stink about today is not the reason it's making a stink. It wants to destroy the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and it will go after it in whatever form we have. So I don't think, given the power relations, I mean, Israel, no matter how talented, no matter how powerful it is, it's still a country of only 9 million people. The United States is 330 million or whatever it is. Something in those terms. China is, God knows how many Chinese there are. These are elephants, and Israel is maybe not a mouse, but a squirrel in comparison. It can't play the powers off against each other effectively. It has to make a decision. I think it's better for the world, better for the United States, better for Israel if we keep Israel and the United States closely tied and working together against the Chinese world order. What we have to start doing, people don't want to do it. When I say people, I'm happy to do it, but I think in a pro-Israel community that has been steeped in an ethos of bipartisanship, they don't want to stand up and say the woke left is the enemy of American national security. But it is.
Again, Michael, your remarks are a segue to my next question, and since, Ben, you alluded to this earlier, maybe I'll start off with you. This idea that support for Israel within America, or at least within the political class, is no longer a bipartisan issue. We see that over and over again. Is that accurate? And whether it's accurate or not, is there anything that the Israelis can do, that the Bennett administration, the Bennett government could do to broaden support within both parties?
Well, first off, I'm a little hurt that I didn't get a round of applause after my last answer, but I won't take it too personally.
Three people did it, so you're okay.
We'll get there, don't worry. Listen, I think it's safe to say that bipartisan support is no longer ironclad. But I don't think you can extrapolate that to say that Israel is now strictly a partisan issue. I think the Iron Dome vote alone just really drove the point home about how much Ner unanimity there is in Washington for support for Israel. That doesn't mean that the pro-Israel community should feel comfortable or they should rest on their laurels, but, you know, all is not lost if you are a supporter of Israel in America. That doesn't change the fact that, you know, there needs to be a true reckoning with how the next generation of voters really considers Israeli policy. So bipartisan support is still here. It's not as strong as it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's not trending in the right direction. You know, what do you do about countering that trend? I think that's the real question rather than where are we at right now?
Yeah.
You can't give yourself applause. That's not how this works.
You got a couple of...
Look, a couple things. First, and I alluded to this earlier, this is all cyclical. You can have anti-Israel politicians on the right, as Paul Finley was in the 1980s. You can have them on the left. I think that right now it feels more dangerous, as Tammy indicated, because of TikTok, because of Instagram, because of Twitter. You give yourself an outsized microphone, and there are people who are out there amplifying it for you, and you know, and for their own reasons. But I think that the real key here to just focus on for a moment, and this you know, maybe it's a little depressing, or maybe it's a little hard to get our heads wrapped around it, but American politics right now is a dumpster fire. If I can use a technical term, we're a mess. I don't think that these are Democratic ideas or Republican ideas, not in the traditional sense any longer. And I would say that isolationist ideas are growing on both the left and the right. The idea that we shouldn't be engaging or investing in allies around the world is growing, not shrinking. I think Mike's also right in the cynical way that a number of people address the issue of human rights, ignoring what goes on in Iran and then focusing on what goes on in Israel. But there is no consistency really anywhere right now. And I have a really hard time drawing a straight line between the Republican Party of George W. Bush to where we are today. I certainly have a hard time drawing a straight line from LBJ to Biden. I think that, you know, to a certain extent, it feels like everything is up in the air. In another couple of years, we may see vastly different parties, at which point, you know, we'll have to probably go back to the drawing board in terms of what it means to be bipartisan. But we're in a moment of flux, folks. It's hard to gauge any of this right now. I think we can, though, isolate a handful of people that appear to be driving this. There's maybe one or two on the right now, about maybe 9 or 10 on the left. And then there are those that are willing to go along with it. And that's my biggest problem. They're all triangulating right now. You've got members of Congress that were once shoo-ins for AIPAC positions that are now trying to figure out, okay, let me test the wind. Let me see which way the wind's blowing and decide where. And we're talking about pro-Israel members of Congress that are now not sure how they're going to vote on Iron Dome or on aid or on an Iran deal. The Iran deal was a great litmus test for me, by the way, looking at traditionally pro-Israel members of Congress who ended up, you know, just going along. And I think that's a real problem. So just let's keep an eye on this, because it's going to be a mess, I think, for at least another 4 to 8 years.
I just want to add one point to that. So after the Gaza war, you know, if you asked Israeli officials in Jerusalem which lawmakers' criticism they were most concerned with, it wasn't AOC, it wasn't Ilhan Omar, it wasn't Rashida Tlaib, it was Jerry Nadler and Bob Menendez, two of the most pro-Israel stalwarts in Congress, and they were leading the charge of saying the Biden administration needed to do more to make sure Israel got a handle on the situation. If that doesn't raise cause for alarm about the changing center of gravity within the Democratic Party, I don't know what will.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.